There's a lot of groups, a lot of institutions in this country want to control your language, tell you what you can say and what you can't say. Government wants to tell you some things you can't say because they're against the law, or you can't say this because it's against the regulation, or here's something you can't say because it's a secret. Government wants to control information and control language because that's the way you control thought. And basically that's the game they're in. Political activists, anti-bias groups, special interest groups are going to suggest the correct political vocabulary, the way you ought to be saying things, because we do think in language. And so the quality of our thoughts and ideas can only be as good as the quality of our language. So maybe some of this patriarchal shit ought to go away. I think spokesman ought to be spokesperson. I think chairman ought to be chairperson. I think mankind ought to be humankind. But they take it too far. They take themselves too seriously. They exaggerate. They want me to call that thing in the street a person hold cover. I think that's taking it a little bit too far.
In December of 2022, Stanford University's IT department launched a new initiative for the elimination of harmful words. The goal was to squeeze potentially offensive language out of websites and documents. To this end, they published a list of harmful words and phrases and also a website. Somehow the media got a hold of the list, and they were not kind in their coverage.
So Stanford University is facing backlash after its IT department added the word American to its harmful language index under imprecise language. IT staffers are being told to use the term U.S. citizen instead, to not insinuate the U.S. is the most important country in the Americas. Immigrant is also out, to be replaced by the terms person who immigrated or non-citizen. Walk-in hours is now scrapped for open hours, to not be ableist or somehow appear to leave out members of the community who might be in wheelchairs, for example. Stanford University still has not responded to our request for comment, but told the New York Post the guidelines are meant only for internal use.
The Stanford Review, a student-run paper on campus, led the charge. Here's the executive editor of the Stanford Review explaining his thinking.
It's so crazy that, and I'd like to highlight also that on the list, there's terms like he and she that you can't use. There's terms like grandfather. And so they're really just trying to butcher the English language in their pursuit of diversity and inclusivity. And it isn't diverse, and it doesn't actually include anybody when you can't say anything. And so, if anything, this list is just a complete waste of resources.
About 2 weeks after launch, Stanford shut down the website, admitting it had, quote, missed the mark. This isn't the first time Stanford's been in trouble for restraining speech on campus. In 2022, the free speech advocacy organization, known as FIRE for short, ranked Stanford the worst school for free speech protections that year. And this is out of 486 schools that they evaluated.
You know what I mean? It's just like we've decided there'll be some words we won't say all the time. And I was just trying to find out which words they were. For sure, all of them. I wanted a list.
And here it is, 14 unimpressive, often hilarious pages, full of logical gaps, inconsistencies, and errors. The list does come with a trigger warning, except the word trigger is violent and it's on the list of words to eliminate, so they call it a contents warning.
A new study from Flinders University analyzed a dozen other studies on trigger warnings, and they all came to the same conclusion. They don't work. Not only don't they protect your feelings, but if you actually have been traumatized by something they're warning you about, a trigger warning makes it worse.
The words are organized by transgression. Every ist and ism is included. The organizing principle, again, seems to be avoiding offending anyone. The Cambridge Dictionary tells us that not offending is the most important consideration. For example, under ableist speech, they tell us that addict should be called a person with a substance abuse problem, because addict trivializes the condition, apparently. It gets worse. Instead of addicted, we are instructed to say hooked or devoted. Devoted is obviously not a synonym for addicted. And how is hooked less offensive than addicted? OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is to be changed to detail-oriented. This is changing the accepted term for a mental disorder and replacing it with a term that is not a disorder. If anything is trivializing a condition, it's changing OCD to detail-oriented. And seriously, how many people with OCD are offended by that term? Killing two birds with one stone. Supposedly, this normalizes animal cruelty. So using that phrase must set off double homicides of birds, one stone at a time. A new implicit rule emerges from this list. And that rule is that black and white are racialized terms and must only be used in contexts where black can be construed as positive and white as negative. Some examples of words which are not to be used include blackballed, black mark, and black sheep, which are negatives, and white paper and white space, where white is supposedly positive. So what makes white space positive? It's just a thing. It's blank space, and there's no aspersions being cast on non-white space. This is just creating racial tension where it doesn't exist. In effect, Stanford is emphasizing words that are not intended to be racist and making them racist, which means we're instructing people to be hypersensitive and easily offended. Another example of a solution in search of a problem is the word Latinx, and substituting that for Hispanic or Latino. Merriam-Webster states that Latinx was intended as a non-gendered version of Latino by LGBT activists to make language more gender inclusive. But it's not catching on with Spanish speakers. A Gallup poll shows that only 4% of Spanish-speaking people in the U.S. prefer Latinx. Some Spanish speakers feel very strongly that this is arrogant cultural appropriation. This op-ed piece from the Phoenix states very clearly, U.S. English speakers deemed Spanish to be too backward, and rather than working within the language, fixed it from a foreign perspective. Latinx is virtually non-existent in Spanish-speaking countries. This is a prime example of how English speakers can't stop imposing their social norms on others. This study from 2023 tells us that being hyper-aware of supposedly offending words can be harmful. It shows that if you are primed to be offended, you're more likely to be offended. The result of all this, I believe, is the declining mental health on our campuses. Research by Dr. Jonathan Haidt shows that from 2010 to 2020, anxiety among U.S. undergraduates increased 134%. Depression increased 106%. As language becomes socially risky and ever more complicated, many students stop expressing themselves openly. Half of college students surveyed say they fear expressing their ideas in the classroom.
Many students told us that they've been hesitant to publicly dissent.
I'm afraid of having a nuanced opinion because I'm afraid that my opinions and I will be stigmatized.
It's a rather strange sentence to hear on a university campus. I'm fearful of my nuanced opinion.
As students head back to class, a new book challenges colleges to better prepare young people for life after they graduate. The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. The book says many teens and young adults are unprepared for the real world. Authors Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, that's Haidt, not hate,
That's right.
Right in the book. Many university students are learning to think in distorted ways, and this increases their likelihood of becoming fragile, anxious, and easily hurt. They join us at the table.
Right about that. Adolescent anxiety and depression are unlike anything seen in modern times. So how have campuses and schools changed as a result of that?
And that's the scariest revelation for us and doing the research for it is that, our argument is essentially we have anxious, depressed, and polarized students, and we're wondering how we got there. And our point is that we're teaching the mental habits of anxious, depressed, and polarized people.
Mm-hmm. And so how students learn to frame things will greatly affect whether they thrive or whether they retreat into a shell in a defensive crouch in college.
What they do is reinforce the idea that trauma is central to your identity and that you should let it define you instead of dealing with it, dispatching it, and moving beyond it. People wonder why the younger generations have so much anxiety. It's this stuff.
It's all gone too far. We need a pendulum swing back towards sanity and reality.